"400 years ago, in 1610, John Speed, a London mapmaker and publisher, came to survey South Wales. His maps were the first to be commercially available to the public and showed a marked improvement in quality over previous maps. This is his map of Glamorganshire. As part of the document, he included detailed street plans of two towns that he considered to be important. One was the growing town of Cardiff. With a population of over 3,000, it was the major port of South Wales. The other was, surprisingly, Llandaff. Today, Llandaff is part of the city of Cardiff, a city within a city, but for centuries it had its own independent existence. It was not only an important place of pilgrimage, it had a castle, maintained its own borough, and held market days and fairs. As the inscription on the base of the cross on the green proclaims, Llandaff was a city long before Cardiff, as it had a cathedral. And it is from the cathedral that the name Llandaff was derived. The use of the prefix Llan in Welsh place names signifies the site of an early Celtic church, as in Llan Trisant. So, being on the banks of the River Taff, an early Celtic church here became known as the Llan Taff. The cathedral, standing on one of the oldest Christian sites in Britain, has had a turbulent past. I could easily dedicate this whole DVD to the cathedral alone, but there is so much more to discover. So come with us now as we unearth fascinating stories within the ancient manors of Llandaff, Fairwater and St Fagans. The Roman occupation of South Wales was to last for over 300 years. They finally packed up and left in the 5th century. Wales then entered what we now call the Dark Ages, as very little is known of what went on for some 800 years. What we do know, however, is that in around 500 AD, Eli, the son of a Welsh prince who had been born in Tenby, went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. On his return, he had adopted the Breton name of Tylo. He set up a small minster, that's a church and a monastery, in a hollow on the west bank of the River Taff, close to an existing river crossing at Cybalva. The name Cybalva actually means crossing or ferry point. And from here, pilgrims began to cross to visit that little church, now long gone. 200 years after his death, he became Saint Tylo. The only relic that has survived from that time is this early Celtic carved stone cross. Known as a Sutton cross, it was found hidden in a nearby well in 1870, hidden there by monks during the Reformation to prevent its destruction. It must have held some special significance. Perhaps St. Tylo himself had touched it. The original church is thought to have been up here, high above the river, where the ruins of the old bell tower are today. The magnificent cathedral we see today began with the Normans. They arrived in South Wales in 1080. They came with an army of 12 knights and over 3,000 men, waging battle with all that stood in their way. But they were also deeply religious and keen to get the abbot of Llandaff on their side. They made him Lord of the Manor of Llandaff, a vast area in those days, which included the Principality of Siluria, which is what we now call Gwent. Over 240 churches were under his control. He lived here in this castle. The living quarters are no longer standing, but he must have lived a luxurious lifestyle compared to the ordinary people of the time. This is the seal of Bishop Urban, the first to call himself Bishop of Llandaff. Although he was of Welsh descent, he had adopted the Latin name of Urban, and it was he that began building the first cathedral in 1107. Slightly smaller than the present building, it is shown here in red, totally within the plan area of today's cathedral. Some features of the Norman building have been retained over the years. This archway on the east wall and a matching one on the outside on the west wall are typically Norman. Semicircular and highly decorated. They would have been the main entrances in medieval times. This chancel arch also survives in place from the original Norman church. The cathedral has changed dramatically over the last 900 years. Firstly, the impressive west front and entrance were added in around 1220. Today, it is one of the most notable medieval works of architecture that survive in Wales. The imposing entrance incorporates the figure of a bishop welcoming you in. It is thought to be St Duffrig. The 13th century saw the addition of the Lady Chapel beyond the altar, with its fabulous windows and ornate ceiling. During this time, the octagonal chapter house was also built, together with a freestanding bell tower up on the green. It's now in ruins, destroyed by Owain Glyndŵr in the 15th century. And towards the end of the 15th century, the northwest tower called the Jasper Tower was added, a gift from Jasper Tudor, Lord of Glamorgan. It was built to house the bells, which had previously been in the bell tower. Compared to some of the more elaborate burials in the cathedral, the tomb of St Tylo is quite a modest affair. His little chapel is quite simple and plain, with a shrine containing a skull fragment of the saint. It was to this shrine that pilgrims flocked, until Henry VIII put a stop to it in 1536 with his reformation of the Catholic Church. The monastery was closed down and cathedral treasures confiscated for the crown. If that wasn't bad enough, 100 years later, during the English Civil War, on Easter Sunday 1646, Oliver Cromwell's troops arrived. They stayed for some days, drank all the communion wine, and kept themselves warm by burning not only the pews, but the complete library of priceless manuscripts. In the years that followed, the cathedral fell into a state of ruin, which was to last for over 200 years. It was not until the late Victorian era that major rebuilding began. John Pritchard, a local architect who had just completed St John's in Canton, was chosen to reconstruct the cathedral to what we see today. He increased the height of the outside walls and added the high-level clear-story windows. The towers were rebuilt, and a splendid new spire, possibly modelled on St John's, was added. This was very controversial at the time, equivalent to putting up a mobile phone mast today. Here is the tomb of St Duffrig, one of the 3 Welsh saints that Llandaff is dedicated to, together with St Peter and Paul added during the Victorian rebuild. There are 5 altogether, and they're represented on the Llandaff coat of arms. The mitres represent St Tylo, St Duffrig and St Aethogwy. Below them are the keys of St Peter and the sword of St Paul. This garden of remembrance has been formed in the crater of a German bomb that exploded here on the night of the 2nd of January 1941. The ensuing blaze destroyed much of the roof and left the building in ruins once again. George Pace was the architect chosen for the restoration of the war damage. He blended old and new, giving the cathedral a wonderful sense of light and space, and took many years to complete. He added the Welsh Regiment Chapel, a place of meditation. It commemorates the regiments and Welshmen who gave their life fighting for their country. His most controversial addition is in the main body of the cathedral. Spanning the nave on a vast but delicate concrete arch is Sir Jacob Epstein's statue Christ in Majesty. Cast in aluminium, its sheer scale is quite awe-inspiring. The final piece to be replaced was the very top of the spire in 1957. As with any building of this magnitude, the ongoing repair work is never ending. But it's ironic that the most recent damage was caused by an act of God. It was a stormy night in 2007 when a bolt of lightning struck and caused major damage to the organ. An appeal fund was immediately set up for a new organ. Here it is being installed in 2010. Up on the green is the stone lich gate, also designed by John Pritchard. And close by lie the ruins of the bishop's castle. The tranquil gardens now form a very pleasant escape from the bustle of the busy High Street. Little is known about the castle except that it was laid ruin by Owen Glendower in the 15th century, at the same time as the bell tower, which once boasted a 5.5-ton bell. The ruins of the tower were not always visible as they are today. They were hidden behind the Red Lion Hotel, which stood on the green 100 years ago. Opposite was the White Lion. Although now a private house, it became a pub for a day, when the green became the fictional village of Ledworth for an episode of Doctor Who in 2009. Overlooking the green for almost 80 years was the Cathedral School, one of the oldest schools in Wales. It had been started in the chapter house back in the 9th century. This young lad proudly shows off his new uniform in the early 50s before his first day at school. The school provides the cathedral choir, which can be heard at evensong most days. The famous writer Roald Dahl attended the school in 1923, but more about him later. Sports days were held on the field behind the cathedral. The school on the green, originally built for just 50 pupils, suffered war damage and was too small. So in 1958 they moved to the former Bishop's Palace. This splendid building, built for Admiral Thomas Matthews in 1744, was known as Llandaff Court. He never liked the place and sold it to the church as a new bishop's palace. The little chapel was then added in 1859. Girls were first admitted to the school in 1978, and today it has over 600 pupils. The Jubilee building houses today's state-of-the-art music departments, carrying on a tradition as the only cathedral school now in Wales. There used to be another school in Llandaff, the National School in High Street.
Went to the old school, which is unfortunately been knocked down. That's where the spa is now in Llandaff. The back of it, the infant school is still there. The infant school is still there, not as used as a school. Used to be called Church in England School, but then it's Church in Wales School now, but it was always called Church in England, or the National School. Something had happened in class, in Miss Evans's class. And Miss Evans's class was a scholarship class. That was where you sat what they call 11 plus now, but it was a scholarship at the time. And I'd upset one of the lads for whatever reason, and he wouldn't describe him as a hard nut, but we kept our distance from him, which meant that at 4 o'clock, or whenever we finished school, 4:15, we had to have a fight on the green. And I was dreading having this fight on the green because I knew I wasn't going to come out very well. And so anyhow, we went round, and of course all your mates come round and so forth. And then he was knocking me for 6, if I can remember. Not a fight as you'd imagine, no. But I mean, it's more of a wrestle, isn't it? It wasn't a fight where there's big punches going. But I was getting the worst of it, and I was quite pleased when Mr. Penhalric, who was the headmaster, who lived right next to the school in the schoolhouse, came around, separated us, took us back. So I was quite pleased, except we ended up having a cane. That was the worst part of that. Best times, I enjoyed my childhood there. And I think when you look back, you only look back on the best parts of it. You tend to forget anything that wasn't so good. But I can remember that it's with affection because people looked out for you. We did know everybody, and it was a local school. Dad worked, he was I suppose they call him nowadays a master craftsman, but he was carpenter and joiner, I think was the word they used to use years ago. And he did a lot of work in and around the cathedral and possibly other churches, I don't know. And I was in the choir, eventually rising the head boy at one stage. That was the parish choir, mine, I must point out, because there's a parish choir and then there was the cathedral school choir, which there were quite a few little scraps used to go on between the two of us. And of course, being the local scruffs, we usually won, because they used to wear mortarboards, which were quite handy for throwing. But I can remember the cathedral as a youngster as effectively the lady chapel, which was just the small section. The rest of it was completely open. There was no roof on it. Everything was open, rain came in and so on. There was no steeple on the cathedral. And I assumed as a youngster that's how it was supposed to be, not realising that it had been taken down, and it kept a lot of the stones. Dad, he's made a chair, 2 oak chairs he's made, out of oak, which came from the cathedral. He had a lot of timber, as probably a lot of other people did as well at the time, probably as well for firewood and so forth. And he's made 2 chairs which he carved at home, one for myself and one for my sister Margaret. And he's carved on the back just a small impression of the cathedral. They're very hard to sit in, mind. They look very nice, but as regards sitting in, I don't know if I could sit in them for too long.
As one might expect, much of Llandaff is connected with the clergy. St Michael's College is the foremost training school for the clergy in the country. It was founded on St David's Day 1892 in Aberdare and moved to Llandaff in 1907. This little house alongside is where architect John Pritchard lived. Here on the High Street, these buildings are St Andrew's and St Cross. They are lodgings for senior clergy who are preparing to become canons. Nearby, this Chinese takeaway was honoured with a blue plaque in September 2009. It recalls that 80 years ago this was a small sweet shop. It was frequented by the young Roald Dahl and his school friends, and run by an old witch who hated the children. At the age of 8, a plot was hatched to put a dead mouse into a jar of gobstoppers on the counter. It had the desired effect on the old woman, but she complained to the cathedral school and identified young Roald as the culprit. He received a caning, and his parents moved him to a school in Weston-super-Mare shortly afterwards. The probate registry is more of John Pritchard's work. At one time, this was where all wills were recorded and verified. Now rather overgrown, this little building, looking a bit like a large dog kennel, was an ancient well, where the Llandaff people drew their water before a pipe supply was introduced. When Speed's map was drawn in 1610, the population of Llandaff was less than 100. By 1840 it had grown to 1,000, and records show that just 20 years later it was 6,500, and by 1890, 18,000. This is because the manor of Llandaff included Canton, an area growing rapidly with the coal boom. Although Llandaff became part of Cardiff in 1922, much has remained untouched, such as the green. The statue of James Rice Buckley, a vicar of Llandaff, has looked out over the green and the cathedral for over 80 years. It is the work of a Cardiff sculptor, John Goscombe. The war memorial on the opposite side of the green is another of his fine works. Wherever you turn in Llandaff there is history. This is a fragment of gravestone, exactly where it landed in 1941 when the cathedral was bombed. The end wall of this private house in Hale Fair contains stones from a medieval window that was part of the Black Hall, a lodging house and hospice belonging to the Black Friars in medieval times. Nearby and dating from 1770 is Llandaff House. It was split into two houses, Crossway and Llandaff House, in 1900 and is now in 6 flats. It had been built for Sir Thomas Edwards, who seemed to own about half of Llandaff at the time. Windsor, and the courts were regularly held at the house. After he died, it became the home of Sir John Humphrey, JP and High Sheriff. When the house was built, it had spacious gardens that stretched for around 8 acres, and in the farthest corner was an ornamental stone summer house. It had been given to him in 1772 by Lady Windsor and dates from the 13th century. As this old engraving shows, it was once part of Cardiff Castle. Today the tower is under wraps in the grounds of Rookwood House, built in 1886 on part of the gardens purchased from the Edwards family. But still below the tower, through this hidden doorway, are underground chambers. Now, many rich men of the period obtained their wealth from dubious sources, and so it's quite possible that Thomas Edwards used it as a secret store for smuggled goods and contraband. For it turns out his relative Edward Edwards was a notorious pirate operating out of Penarth. At dead of night, smuggled goods could be brought up the Taff, up the Dean steps, and secreted away here. The police and revenue men would never think to search the grounds of such a prominent citizen. Rookwood House was built in 1886 for Colonel Edward Stock Hill and designed by John Pritchard. It included this wonderful camellia house, built out of teak with mosaic inset panels. Above the entrance are three odd carved panels. One is of ship, another a gun team, and lastly the House of Commons. It turns out these were the main activities of the late Colonel. The grounds contain many fine botanical specimens. These two giant redwood trees were planted to commemorate the birth of his two sons. In 1918 it became an officers' convalescent home, and in 1932 a general hospital. Just opposite, and sometimes incorrectly called Llandaff Court, is this fine old house, Insole Court. It had been the home for 3 generations of the Insole family, who were wealthy coal mine owners and shippers. The first house built by James Insole in 1855 was a modest double-fronted property called Ely Court. As family fortunes grew, the house was demolished 20 years later and then rebuilt in this wonderful Gothic style that was favoured by Lord Bute. After the First World War, their fortunes dwindled, and the house and the wonderful grounds were sold to the Cardiff Corporation. Today the grounds are just a fraction of what they used to be. In 1932 the extensive gardens were dug up to make way for the extension to Western Avenue. On the completion of Western Avenue, the rest of the grounds of the house were then given over to this housing estate. The old police station lives on as apartments, but a house which didn't survive was Bainton House. It had been built in 1866 for Alexander Bassett, a civil engineer working on the new docks. Today the grounds are home to BBC Wales, the largest BBC studios outside London. The BBC opened here in 1966 and Bainton House was demolished in 1975. The studios employ over 1,200 and produce a wide variety of programmes for television and radio, in both English and Welsh. A notable TV success is Doctor Who, which is filmed on location around the city. This award-winning series is sold to over 42 countries around the world, and it's the longest running science fiction show on television. Not many people know, but there used to be another broadcaster in Llandaff, back in the 60s. These offices are on the site of the old Teledu Cymru studios, a short-lived commercial channel that was no match for TWW on the far side of the fields. The studios closed in 1968 and were converted into offices for the Welsh Joint Education Committee. The offices have now been rebuilt in this interesting but controversial design. The offices overlook Llandaff Fields. Cardiff is very lucky to have these fields as open space, for they were put on sale by the Bishop of Llandaff in 1898 for an extension to Cathedral Road. But Charles and Herbert Thompson, who lived nearby, bought them for £5,000 and then gave them to the council as public open space. Above the fields is Howell School, with its well-established reputation for academic excellence. It's the foremost girls' school in Wales. But it does have an odd history. It was built by the Drapers Company of London in 1860 for the education and clothing of orphan girls. The school takes its name from one of their Welsh merchants, Thomas Howell, who in 1540 set aside 12,000 gold ducats for this very purpose. Today the school is a day school, but in the past it was a boarding school, and many of these houses were dormitories for the girls. Here ex-pupils came on a visit and remembered old times. This is your room.
This is where we were in our bedroom very first when we were 11.
How many were in here altogether?
10.
Well,
Ten
there
in
were 5
this
each
room.
side.
10. And the big cupboards in the middle.
It was freezing. Do you remember leaving, if you left a mug of water out
Yes.
in the winter, it would freeze over?
Oh, yeah, of course. The inside of the window. And no hot water bottles allowed. They weren't allowed to have a water bottle. No.
There's a bed there.
I was there.
I can remember being
I
in
was
that one over
there.
there. And we went into the greenhouse and we each stole a green tomato. It was hideously sinful. I mean, God knows what they ever did with them.
Yeah.
But unfortuitously, the following nights, some kids broke in and they smashed the greenhouse up, and we spent a week in absolute terror thinking they'd find our fingerprints on the tomatoes.
DNA.
Absolutely, yeah.
She came in the house. We just came in whether it was in the morning.
Just down from the school, this is part of the original road to Llandaff Mill. It was a water-powered corn mill dating back over 1,000 years and stood near where the rugby club is today. It was demolished in 1930 when Western Avenue was built. The mill pond had always been a magnet for the children, and so when Western Avenue was built, they made it into a more formal open-air pool. The water to power the mill came from the River Taff. Where the river cuts through this sandstone outcrop, a weir was built to hold back the water. This was then routed through the cathedral graveyard to the mill. This photo from the 50s shows it clearly. Today the graveyard bridge is still there, but the mill stream is long gone. The deep water held back by the weir is ideal for recreation. This is the Taff Rowing Club Regatta in 1930. In 1945, the Taff Rowing Club and the Cardiff Rowing Club amalgamated to form the Llandaff Rowing Club. Rowing has become increasingly popular since Britain's medal success at the Olympic Games. Above the bridge on the west bank of the river is Radder Court. Farmland until 40 years ago, it is now Danes Court housing estate. It was all part of the Manor of Llandaff in medieval times, and the pub was the manor house until 1830, when it became a farmhouse. Alongside it is the lovely old church of St John the Baptist, built by the de Clare family in the 13th century. It stands on the site of an ancient wayward shrine, referred to by St Cadach as the prayer place, which in Welsh is Aradwr, and the origin of the name Radder. The old graveyard yew tree is believed to be over 1,000 years old. And the novel revolving gate is one of only 2 in Britain. The graveyard is where Roald Dahl's parents are buried. Roald was born here in Fairwater Road in 1916, in what was then called the Villa Marie. His father had come from Norway and ran a successful ship's chandlers in Cardiff docks. Roald is most remembered for his wonderful children's books, but he wrote for adults as well. James Bond, You Only Live Twice, was just one of his numerous stories written for Hollywood. At the junction of Llantrisant Road and Bridge Road stood a small toll house known as Llandaff Gate. It was used up until 1851 to collect payment to cross the Taff Bridge. The present concrete and steel bridge is a replacement for a 3-arched stone bridge built back in 1770. This side of the river is known as Llandaff North. It grew up around the Glamorganshire Canal that ran along here until the late 50s, when it was drained and filled in. This old photo shows the canal lock at the Cow and Snuffers. The pub was originally a smaller inn called the Red Cow.
Hello, my name's Joanne Owens. I've been a landlady here now for coming up 4 months. The building's 215 years old. There used to be old bare knuckle fist fighting when it first opened. Farmers used to walk their cows past, back and forth to each other's farms. That's where the name The Cow came from. Cow and Snuffers was, again, the same story with the cow, but with the Snuffers, a gentleman used to walk the streets putting out the lights with the snuff. And that's where the name originally came from. We are the only name that's got the Cow and Snuffers in Britain. It's been researched about it. It's famous as in, the stories are Benjamin Disraeli visited here and stayed quite often with his mistress, Miss Lewis from Tongwynlais. She lived in Green Meadow Mansion in Tongwynlais. Rumours have it that he finished with his mistress and she hung herself upstairs on the 3rd floor. And again, rumours say she still haunts the building. In fact, I have 2 ex-landlords that drink here, and they've both seen her. I haven't yet, as I said. The one old landlord have said that she's a banshee. So, and she has got it in for landladies. Not landlords, landladies. But she's yet to approach me. I won't go upstairs on my own.
This was once known as the Square, and just to the right was Llandaff Yard. Here could be found all sorts of industry connected with the canal, from small iron foundries, coal merchants, to the processing of dead horses for glue, soap and hides. Built in the centre of all this in 1890 was All Saints Church. Like the cathedral, it suffered major bomb damage during the war. The son of Reverend Francis Lewis of Llandaff emigrated to America in 1713 and became Governor of New York, and was one of the 56 who signed the famous Declaration of Independence in 1776. How's that for getting on in the world? Hawthorne Farm stood halfway up Station Road, just on the left. It was demolished in 1890 and the farmland became housing and a new school. The area was expanding rapidly after the opening of the railway. Llandaff Station opened in 1840, and I don't think the bridge has been painted since. This was the Taff Vale Railway. It linked the ironworks at Merthyr with Cardiff Docks and was opened in 1836. It was designed by the great man himself, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and was his first narrow gauge line, being only 4 foot 8.5 wide, which is now standard across the country. The fare to Merthyr in 1840 was 5 shillings. That's just 25p. One of the many industries of Llandaff North was the Eagle Foundry. It was just behind the Pineapple Pub, and many Cardiff manhole and drain covers bear their name. Just opposite, James and Jenkins occupy the old Tivoli Cinema. It had opened in 1914 as the Cinema Royal and closed in 1958. The railway forms the boundary between Llandaff North and Whitchurch, and right next to it stood the Crown Hotel.
I currently live in Llandaff North off College Road, which was the site of the former Crown Public House, and last owner was Billy Waith, the European middleweight champion in his day, and an entertaining character all round. The Crown itself obviously was an old-fashioned 3-storey pub with a basement skittle alley here, which you had to go down a very rickety and narrow curved staircase to get to, which I never quite understood, because Skittles is a drinking game, and the more you had, the more dangerous that staircase got. I was born in Ely and grew up in Fairwater from the 1962 onwards, if you like, and it is fascinating in Fairwater in particular, where the Fairwater pub is, that there's a road by the name of Cartwright Lane, and there's Wellwright Road and that kind of thing. And the stories tell you there was training stables there for horse racing in Fairwater, because they used to race the Welsh Grand National on Ely Racecourse, and it says that one of the Fairwater horses won that. In 1905, there's only 100 people lived in Fairwater. In the 1930s, they built the lower half of Fairwater, and in the 1950s and 60s, they built the second part of Fairwater and Pentrabane Estate.
Fairwater, or Farewell as it was once known, was also part of the manor of Llandaff. The bishop sold it to the Matthews family in 1553, and it was later owned by William Cartwright. The lovely old cast iron direction post was made at the Eagle Foundry in Llandaff North in 1880. It became a suburb of Cardiff in 1922. The green still forms the focal point of the area today. And opposite, just here, stood a charming cottage known as the Smithy, or Swiss Cottage to the children. Built in 1898, it was sadly demolished in 1972. The wonderful twisted barley sugar chimney pots were carefully removed, as his Echo article recalls. They were sold to America. This road remembers the nautical college that stood here. Unfortunately, we couldn't find a picture of it. It had been a gift from Sir Reardon Smith in 1921 as an officer and cadet training centre. It was later taken over by Uick, who sold it for £3.6 million as a housing site.
Fairwater Park was better known to the children of the area as the Dell. It was an adventure playground on a grand scale. The pond had minnows and newts. There was a tree with a rope swing that went right over the water. In the winter it always froze over, providing dares for the boys. Funny how the winters then were always cold and summers hot, not like today. Near the pond there was a quarry, and further along still was a grass slope that later became the ski centre, the first in Wales. On a Sunday I had to take my younger brothers and sisters for a walk, as we weren't allowed to play on a Sunday as my stepfather wouldn't allow due to his Baptist upbringing. We would go to the Dell. My sister and brother would help me to push the pram up the slopes as it was very steep. I would vary the routes as we were very lucky to have such a wealth of beautiful countryside on our doorstep.
This tiny house has a wonderful history, for in 1920s it was Grove Farm Dairy, run by Harry Dibbant. And later, George Wilson's boot repairers were there, followed by a dressmaker. Much of the industry of Fairwater has now disappeared, leaving just ghostly memories. These council houses are the highest in Cardiff. At 77 metres above sea level, they needed their own water tower. Better known as the Lollipop for obvious reasons, it can be seen for miles around. Today it's unused, except as a mobile phone mast.
Coedbachen Woods, top of Pentrabane, where you can see the Lollipop, the water tower up there, just underneath that. There's a lot of history in there because it was part of the Plymouth estates and it was an arboretum planted by the Earls of Plymouth to promenade. But also, as the things that are in there, some fantastic trees, if the kids will leave them alone, because it is well used by children who like to set fire to trees. There's the Wales's first curling rink, situated in the Coedbachen Woods. It's under a foot of leaf litter now, but the edges of it can clearly be seen. The Buttes were, neighbours as such, and one or two other families of note in the area. It was purely as part of their park because there was a lot more woodland in the area originally, and in Victorian times they spent a lot of money in the area. Alongside the curling rink in particular, there's a bit of brickwork laying on the floor, and that was basically a hut with a stove in it, so that the ladies could stay warm while they were playing the old curling, because obviously it's a winter sport, and we did used to have colder winters, and they used to empty the cistern to put the water into this area and wait for it to freeze, and then go and take the stones out of the hut and push them away, And a lot of people just actually don't know it's there.
Just half a mile from here, in these very fields, way back in 1648, the most important Welsh battle of the English Civil War took place. King Charles I was hell-bent on the abolition of Parliament to gain absolute power. Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, fought battles against him all around the UK. Early on an April morning in 1648, over 8,000 of the King's Royalist forces, led by Major General Larne, who were intent on taking Cardiff Castle, came up against 3,000 of Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads, who blocked their way. The Royalists, dressed in red, or with red sashes, and with superior numbers, fought for over 2 hours. Roundhead commander Colonel Horton gives the signal to his men, who although heavily outnumbered were better trained and equipped, and won the day, taking over 3,000 Royalist prisoners. Over 700 soldiers and 65 villagers died in the battle. Today the village is a quiet retreat from the city. St. Faggan was one of 4 missionaries sent out by the Bishop of Rome in around 180 AD to bring Christianity to Wales. And one would expect the village church to be dedicated to him, but no, this is St. Mary's. St. Faggan's little church is long gone. It probably stood somewhere in the grounds of the castle. The main pub in the village takes its name from the man who owned all the land around here. The 3rd Earl of Plymouth was Clive Windsor. He acquired St. Faggan's Castle through marriage in 1730. These charming thatched cottages are little changed over hundreds of years. They are all part of the Plymouth estate and were built for estate workers. The castle, which is really just a fortified house these days, was a real castle back in the 13th century and home to the Norman lord Peter le Saur, on land given to him by Robert Fitzhamon. By 1475 it belonged to the all-powerful Matthews family of Llandaff. They built the house we see today in 1560. The Earl of Plymouth gave it to the National Museum of Wales in 1948 to become the wonderful open-air museum of Welsh heritage that it is today. Welsh buildings, many scheduled for demolition, have been rescued and moved here stone by stone to preserve them for future generations. The very first building to be moved here in 1949 was this woolen mill from Powys. Taking 20 years in total to reconstruct, it's now back to how it used to be, with brightly decorated interior paintings. And fittingly for this DVD is the Church of St. Tylo. Moved here from near Llandailo, where the saint had died some 40 years after starting his first church at Llandaff.